In this episode, I sit down with Amber Antony, a powerhouse advocate for neuro-inclusion and the founder and director of Neurospicy Collective. Amber is on a mission to redefine the so-called normal, celebrate diversity, and create a world where we embrace imperfect perfection. With both personal and professional experience in neurodiversity, she works with organizations to build inclusive environments where everyone can thrive. Not by changing the people, but by changing the systems around them. We dive into her journey, the challenges neurodivergent individuals may face in society, and how shifting the narrative can unlock your untapped strengths in the workplace and beyond. Welcome back to the Growth Concept Podcast. Welcome to episode 22. I'm your host, Keone Upton, and my goal is to bring you the most impactful conversations to inspire growth and challenge your perspective. This conversation is by far the most amazing conversation I recorded so far on this podcast. Just with the way the events turned out, with filming on South Perth foreshore overlooking the amazing view of Perth. As a result, it was filmed outside, which means sirens scream and Lambos rev. I tried my best to edit out as much as I could. That's enough from me. Let's get into it. Enjoy this episode. Amber, welcome. Thank you very much for meeting me here. I think we can both say this morning's been a bit hectic with rocking up to a library ready to record, and turns out every library is closed.
But they accepted your booking.
Yeah. They took the money and run. Yeah. Yeah, so I think this has worked out very well.
This has worked out beautifully. Look at this
Cruising
view.
on South Perth foreshore recording a podcast. Nice.
Yes, this is not on my bingo card, but here we are. I'm stoked to be here. It just absolutely worked out the best possible way. The most amazing weather, amazing view, amazing company. Very lucky.
I checked out your website. Your mission stood out to me. Your mission was to make the world a more inclusive and diverse place by making it kinder. Do you mind explaining to me why this is your mission and what's the meaning behind it to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you again for having me, Keone. I'm always so honoured that you want to hear me yap away. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So I am a founder of an organisation, director of an organisation called Neurospicy Collective, and it's aimed at neurodivergent folks and folks living with disability. My why stems definitely from previous to my organisation being established, but ultimately a couple of different life events. I'm from the UK. I'm from Great Britain and Northern Ireland, very specifically. So my family live in Northern Ireland, which for anyone that isn't aware, Northern Ireland has had quite a troubled past, particularly around the, I guess, two sides of the same coin, which is Catholics and Protestants living in Northern Ireland. There's a lot of history around that and the settlement of the English and things like that. I grew up very aware of the fact that there were differences in where I'd come from. So my family are Catholic in what is predominantly a Protestant country. And for anyone that's seen Derry Girls is probably a really good kind of example of what it's like. And in particular, my birthday is on Orange Day. So I'm born on the day in Derry Girls where there's the big parade and Grandad Joe drives through it. That's my birthday. So I grew up with very, really aware of being different, I think, and that in the extremes that can end in really sad, tragic circumstances. And a lot of my family and things are involved and live in Northern Ireland with things like bombings and police stations. And obviously we had Bloody Sunday and a real sort of history around what that can look like. And then fast forward sort of all these years and I'm living in Australia and I became a young mum and I've got two gorgeous little dudes. And both of my little boys were diagnosed very early in life with several disabilities and lifelong disabilities. I think early on began to really understand that we can get so much from people who are different and that diversity and difference is actually our greatest strength. But particularly, I think it really started as a mum and seeing what the barriers, systemic barriers that were in place when I was trying to help my little boy.
What do you mean by systemic barriers?
Yeah, so barriers around things like schooling, barriers around things like medical support and intervention, and whether that's barriers like financial barriers, resource barriers, time, who you know, not what you know. And so sort of going back to that point in my life, my little boy was nearly 2, just turned 2 when he got his official diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder and an intellectual disability. And I was incredibly lucky at that time that I financially was in the position to pay for a private diagnosis, but we still had to wait sort of nearly a year, and it cost thousands of dollars. And lots of people don't have those privileges and don't have those resources.
And if you don't know, you can't get the help tailored to you.
Absolutely. And he needed help. Like, he had behaviour's a form of communication, and he was not able to verbally communicate at the time. And so he had behaviours that from the outside looking in, things like hurting himself and hurting other people who didn't understand thought that, he was 2 and 3, thought he was a bully, I remember parents approaching me saying he's a psychopath, like all these really like intense.
So much judgmental.
Yeah, judgment. And I think it definitely really harnessed for me that you don't know what you don't know. And so all these years later, I suppose, like I look at where I'm at now, and we have this organisation. I have an organisation aimed at like sort of connection collective for neurodivergent adults. And I also now work with organisations as a neuro-inclusion consultant. And I suppose what it all kind of landed on was that I never expected to be in the world of autism. And the irony of that whole thing being is that I found out I was autistic at 32. And so it's a really kind of like full circle moment. And I think it comes back to the fact that actually diversity is our greatest strength, and that if we were all the same, how boring that would be for one.
I feel that, yeah.
But also some of the most amazing things that the world's experienced and created and have been innovated were as a result of people with brains that think differently. And so I'm also on this one-woman mission to prove that it's not only is it an amazing, beautiful part of the rich tapestry of our community, but also a real strength, especially in professional settings and when we're looking at adults in the workplace and things like that. And I just think it's just such a beautiful thing, and I'm very grateful for where I'm at, but it was quite a journey to get there, and I think that's probably been the most challenging lesson I've ever learned, is that it is always a journey.
That's absolutely amazing and powerful, Amber, with your mission. With your childhood growing up, you said you were exposed to different religions and all that. Do you feel that kind of helped with adjusting to what you're doing now with the disability sector?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It was something I hadn't really given much thought to until I immigrated to Australia when I was 14. I grew up in London and had Irish family, Northern Irish family, and a lot of them had, I have had family members that have passed away in things like bombings and things like that. So actually, quite ironically, we grew up quite actually non-religious, and I think some of that was because of that experience and background. What's been really interesting about that is I think being Northern Irish and being Catholic, you felt very othered. And so when I used to go back to Northern Ireland, and when I moved back to Ireland when I was 18, I was highly aware of my name, which is very Catholic in what is a Protestant country. I was highly aware of my accent. So I actually think it did, in the sense of it contributed to a very strong sense of feeling like I didn't belong, or that there could be consequences if I was found out to be there, or consequences of people knowing my surname or my family history.
Wow. And
so I think that has made it, I think I've really experienced that sense of otherness, but I wasn't actually directly involved with the Northern Irish Troubles in the sense of, I wasn't living there when they happened. But even generationally, and I think that's probably quite relevant to generational trauma, and there'll be lots of your listeners that can relate to that where you've got family that have experienced something and how that impacts you. So I think it definitely did. I felt very othered. I was very aware of the fact that from the outside looking in, I was like, but you're all Christian. Like, that just doesn't make any sense that you're arguing. Why is this clash happening? And of course, there's so much history behind it, and I'm absolutely not smart enough to understand all of it. But it was a real sense of like, you both are saying you believe in the same thing, and the very principles of what you're saying you believe in is not maybe how the actions are coming across. But it also gave me a very strong understanding of that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And I think that's a really particularly relevant in this day and age, around even more so now with social media and how things are portrayed, that being the victim, history is always written by the victor. And so nothing about us without us is something so relevant to our disability community now, but was absolutely so relevant back then, and still continues to be relevant when we're looking at cultures that have had particularly a British kind of colonisation. I think, they seem like they're really different things, like coming from Northern Ireland and working in the disability community, but I actually think there's a really strong sense of wanting people to feel like they belong and feel safe. And I think that's probably a connection.
And your business, Neurospicy Collective, that helps bring people together and seek that what's the word, like that diversity of acceptance.
Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely acceptance. And it's, for me, the big thing is belonging. And I really love this idea. Brené Brown is very much the creator of this, but something I believe very strongly, especially in my professional career within diversity inclusion, is that fitting in is the opposite of belonging. So fitting in is making like actual intentional steps to change who you are, how you think, what you look like, whatever that might be. And belonging is absolutely being your true self and feeling like you belong. We know that neurodivergent adults in particular are infinitely more likely to experience mental health issues, particularly around depression and anxiety, and that's really very much the whole sense of connection and belonging and a sense of community is one of the biggest factors around positive outcomes, particularly generated from the fact that as an adult you might receive a diagnosis. Self-diagnoses are also incredibly valid. And you have this realization of like, what now? Like, where do I go now? And the first thing they say to you is, I'll find your community. It's like, well, how do I find that? Like, where do I go? Like, and so when I went through that process myself, the realization was there is minimal support networks available for neurodivergent adults in particular. To my knowledge, we're the only neurodivergent founded connection collective in WA. I suspect there might be some nationally, but in WA, certainly not what we're aimed at. And we're very much aimed at an opportunity for just people to connect, and all bodies, all people are welcome to join us. You don't need to be neurodivergent. You don't need to have a pass at the door. But also it is very much aimed at people who do not have NDIS plans. And that was a kind of really important part to recognise that there's a large majority of folks that don't access NDIS and are not able.
Because, as you know, humans are like that social,
Yeah,
we're social creatures. And it's like, if you don't have that belonging or that sense of community, then that can lead into mental health problems and stuff. So I absolutely love what you do, the fact that you're bringing people together that are neurodivergent and seeing the strengths in that, which I feel is so powerful with. We'll talk to a bit later on with the school system on whether that sets you up for success or failure based on your learning disability as such. Yeah,
absolutely. Strengths-based approaches are probably the biggest thing that I work through with my consultancy as well. And it's based around neuroaffirming, which sounds like really technical, and it is a clinical term. But the idea is like this is so relevant to every aspect of your life, whether that's with your partner, your children, your family. The idea that it's strengths-based approaches. So looking at someone's strengths, because everyone has strengths and everyone has things to offer. There are deficits to be fixed, and that's absolutely not correct. There's differences that people need support with, or there's differences that you might need extra help with, but the strengths are there. Everyone has strengths, and if we look at those, and especially I think if you're a leader, particularly of neurodivergent people, but a leader in general, if you look at your team and look at their strengths, that is going to set you up far better than looking at what everyone isn't great at.
Exactly. That's a very good point. You speak about imperfect perfection. What does that actually mean? Do you mind explaining that to me?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is probably a bit of a shout out to my people-pleasing buddies, which is there is a lot of us. This realization, I think, that firstly, that no one is perfect. Absolutely no one. Often, particularly if you've grown up, like you touched on that before, where you might have grown up with maybe not the strongest sense of self, or you're not, you have been in a schooling system that's not really set you up for success and has really not treated you properly the way they could have. A lot of that comes to we think everyone around us is perfect and that we're not, but also that we think if we're perfect, and people pleasing by definition is if I look perfect, act perfect, speak perfectly, study perfectly, get perfect grades, everyone will like me. Nothing will go wrong, everyone will like me. And the irony being that actually the experience of being human is messy and beautiful and sticky and icky and not perfect, and it's glorious. And that's what we need to celebrate. And I think the more we push perfection, and when we're looking at things like social media and all of those things, particularly when you're in a leadership role and you're working in this kind of community, it's very easy to feel like you have to have all the answers. And it's actually a huge amount of power in having the vulnerability to say, I don't know the answer to that, but I'm really excited to be on this journey with you and we'll figure it out together. But I definitely recognize growing up, I had a very high sort of degree of people pleasing. I'm the eldest of 4 girls. I absolutely thought that I needed to do everything perfectly, look perfect, act perfect. And being autistic, which I now realize, like I was a social chameleon. So I did anything to fit in. And that included changing my hair, my clothes, my accent. I just wanted to so desperately be accepted.
Yeah, wow.
And as I got older, I realized like, oh my goodness. And so I thought, well, what do I want my children to know? I want my children to know that everyone makes mistakes. Everyone has things that didn't go the way they wanted. everyone does things and go, oh, that's not, I had the best of intentions, but they didn't go the way I wanted.
Didn't come across that
They
way.
didn't come across that way. And that perfect imperfection is absolutely the goal. That's always the goal.
I truly feel in the media and social media these days, it's so like, yeah, as you know, it's pretty corrupt because everyone's portrayed as perfect. Like you capture the best moment of your life and post that, and the average person scrolling, it's like, that's the norms. People think that, which I find having that awareness in like what you talk about is so important and crucial with just being aware on your own strengths and utilizing your own strengths and powers to your advantage, which is so powerful. Yeah,
and that's such a great point, Keone, because I think sometimes self-reflecting is actually a lot harder because I feel like if we were to sit with our friends and family and I was to say to you, Keone, tell me 5 things about your mum or your dad that you love, or tell me 5 things about your partner that you love, you would easily be able to rattle them off. But if we were to self-reflect and say, tell me 5 things about you that you love, we really struggle and we stumble. And I think some of that is a fear of being seen or sort of interpreted as being up ourselves. There's tall poppy syndrome in the mix. And I think some of it is that we've got these beautiful human skills. I don't call them soft skills. These human skills of things like empathy and compassion, all of those things. And so I think one of the things I've learned along the way that a great therapist told me was like, treat yourself like you would treat your friend. Because if we spoke to our friends the way we internally speak about ourselves, we would have no friends. But yet we say things to ourselves that we would never dream of saying to our friends, and we think that's okay. So that's something I think I'm learning on my journey as well, is that it's okay to treat yourself like you would treat your friend with all of the grace and kindness that you can.
That's a very powerful point. Yeah, I feel that. With all the things you've accomplished in your life, what do you feel one of the most challenging moments in your life was? Was it that self-belief factor and reflection of identifying your strengths, like what you love about yourself? Was that one of your...
Yeah, that's a really great question. I feel like we don't ask these questions of ourselves enough. I think if I was to look at them sort of separately, but they are innately connected, if I look at my personal life, absolutely my boys are the greatest achievement I've ever achieved and probably will ever achieve, and they're absolutely magical. And I was also a young mum, so I was 23 when I got pregnant. It was really unexpected. And I was very early on recognised that my son needed help and had barrier after barrier, and I'm incredibly lucky and privileged by the fact that I am a white, educated, articulate woman, and I at the time had financial resources to support some of that private kind of medical path. But I was met constantly with what I believe to be well-intended professionals, but in professionals who did not understand what I was trying to achieve, but also professionals from a sense of privilege that just did not give me the time to feel heard and seen.
Right, okay.
So I met with very early on, it was a lot of professionals saying, you're a young mum, you just don't know. Why do you feel the need to put a label on him? Children will develop differently. And so it was quite frustrating then by the time we got through to sort of the daycare stage. And by this point, my son's behaviour towards himself and others was becoming quite challenging. And I was having to meet with the parents regularly. And I ended up sending out, when my son got his official kind of diagnosis, I ended up sending out a card with his beautiful little 2-year-old face on it and a little introduction and explanation about what autism spectrum disorder is and how it impacts him and what we're doing to try and support. Because he was, like from the outside looking in, he was hurting other children, but that was absolutely not his intention. I think the frustration for me by that point was like it got to that point of then all of a sudden we were given all this support when it became an impact for other people. But for years before that, I'd been saying we need help. And so he didn't meet any of his developmental milestones, fine motor skills, gross motor skills. He was non-speaking for a long time. We still have doing a lot of amazing work and have an amazing therapy team.
Do you think there was lack of education on the parents' behalf as well as the teachers?
Absolutely.
And stuff? Okay.
And there was a real lack of there was a few particular educators and teachers who were just wonderful. And there was a few parents who I'm still very close with now that were so supportive. But there was a lot of parents that I understand why their default reaction was like, that kid's hurt my kid. What's going on? And there wasn't kind of that moment of like, just that I really believe in responding over reacting. And so I was, I remember going out in public with friends and things like that. And I had this 2-year-old baby and I had a newborn baby who was like 6 weeks old. and my eldest son had pushed another child in the playground and absolutely had pushed this child. And it was sort of 1 minute, we'd walked in the door, he'd gone to the playground, had the baby in my arms, I was with my friend, and this 6-foot man comes storming over, screaming at me, screaming at my son. My son was absolutely hysterical. And he was like, your son's hit my kid. And I, I was like, wow. Like, I was like, I'm so sorry this has happened. Like, and I was sat there obviously like frozen. Like, I was like, I've got a brand new baby. So I think when I look back now, I'm incredibly proud of the fact that I advocated so fiercely for my children.
Yeah.
And I made a lot of very specific choices. So things like moving house, and they go to the most incredible education support school, which is a school for children with disabilities. We've literally won awards, inclusion awards. We won Primary School of the Year, just unbelievable school, and it changed my children's lives infinitely.
So actually being around the environment for that specific disability, or just other kids struggling with the same thing or similar things, because in the traditional schooling system there's that label, and it's like, okay, there's the normal kids, there's the other kids.
Yeah.
And that's how it is,
yeah.
no matter what people say, which I feel being in the environment where everyone's equal and seen as same to an extent is, I imagine that would have a lot more greater effect on the child's process growing up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so you're absolutely right. And I think children, just at their core, children are just the most magical, curious creatures. And they ask a lot of questions and they want to know how things work. And it's just such a beautiful, and I think as adults, we need to be more childlike. We need to do more play as adults. We need to do more storytelling.
Yep.
And that's definitely what I focus on in my professional career. So to answer your question, sort of in my personal life, I think I'm incredibly proud of that. I'm incredibly proud of the resilience I had to show, the advocating. And when you do have a child with a disability, you do go through all this process and you go through grief and all these other feelings and emotions, and they're all incredibly valid. But you end up joining this club you never thought you would be in. You end up joining this club of other parents who have to advocate for their children, and every step, every day, there's something else, whether it's judgment about what they're eating, judgment about the fact they're talking, judgment of the fact that they're not talking or they're talking too much, or then there's judgment about the iPads or not having an iPad. Like, even now, my children, my son's, my youngest son wears nappies at nighttime. He's incontinent at nighttime. The judgment I've had from parents who I think meant well, but said questions like, oh, he's still in nappies at night. And I'm like, yeah. And sort of that shame perpetuating factor.
Right, okay.
So I think one of the biggest things I've learned definitely in this space is the community of other parents with children with additional needs is one of the most beautiful things you'll ever find, because they understand what it feels like to have a child that just needs extra help and extra support. But it does, as a parent, it's exhausting. It's constant advocating. You join this club you never wanted to be a part of, and all of a sudden now you're in their corner. Like, and I sort of imagine, like, if you're a boxer, like, you're in the ring all the time. And I sort of even now sometimes go, gosh, wouldn't it be nice to, like, your child just be able to go to, like, after school care or, like, school holiday camps, or just be able to go, like, do certain activities that my children can't do. But that being said, I also inherently recognize if I did not have that experience, I would not be where I am now.
100%.
I would not be doing what I do now. And I worked in the disability sector when my children were diagnosed. And that was also probably one of the things that gave me a little bit of a spark was at the time, and it's come a long way, but back then, even then, the disability sector was very paternalizing. So by that, I mean, it was very much like, oh, poor you, like, I'll take care of you. It was almost viewed a bit like babysitting. And it was very much this attitude of like, you're not going to come to anything or do anything. So like, how lucky you are that we're here taking you to the shops. Like, it was absolutely not focused on choice and control. It was not focused on promoting independence. And it should always have been that kind of possibility of whatever they want to lead a fulfilling life is what they should be aiming for. And it doesn't matter if you don't think that that's what you want for your life, but if that person with a disability says, I want to do X, Y, and Z, as long as it's not hurting them or anyone else, do it. So if that's that they want to go cooking, or they want to go skydiving, or they want to go dating, or they want to go to a concert, or whatever it is, that's what we should be doing to promote that. So I was in that sector and I was seeing what felt quite paternalistic and also quite hypocritical. So we were out there talking to employers about employing people, autistic people, but we did not employ any autistic people ourselves. And I found that incredibly hypocritical. And so I think a combination of my children being in that space and thinking like, well, what future are they going to have? What will their future look like? How independent will they be? And then being in the sector, I'm thinking there's got to be a better way to do this. And all these years later, it landing on what we already knew, but that, particularly neurodivergence is very much hereditary and genetic. So if you've got neurodivergent children, the likelihood is one or both of the parents are also neurodivergent. It's not a guarantee, but it's very likely.
Interesting, yeah, right.
And so what we see is that often, particularly in women, they get a diagnosis after their children. And we see that particularly in the spaces of ADHD and autism. Very much relevant when you're looking at, like myself, and I think probably like yourself, Keone, when you've gone to school and you've probably had a diagnosis or sort of questions around things like dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, which are all very common conditions, quote unquote, very common presentations in the neurodivergent kind of umbrella. And so then you learn these coping mechanisms essentially. Yeah. And then as an adult, you're like, oh, you mean all those years where I struggled through school and barely got by and didn't feel like I belonged and felt stupid and all of these things. It was because my brain worked differently and I just needed extra support with certain things. And rather than those things you needed support with defining you, which is often what ends up happening in schools, in particular of my generation, they focus on the fact that I struggled with maths rather than focus on the fact that I was excellent at other things and maths was just something that was not my strong suit. So to answer your question, I think my professional and personal sort of greatest achievements are actually massively melded together.
Yeah.
And I'm incredibly grateful for the journey I've been on, as hard as it's been. And, at times I've thought I would never wish this on someone else. I'm so glad that I've had this experience because I'm here now and it's given me such a different perspective.
Your process of going through that school, that diagnosis factor, as well as being diagnosed, I would say at a late age, because you've gone through school, may have undiagnosed struggles and you haven't been able to account that into other things.
Yeah.
With overcoming that problem or issue, how did you do that? Was it simply later on in life educating parents and teachers on what neurodivergent is? Yeah,
great question. Look, it's an absolute journey and I think there's never actually a destination point. I'm still on the journey myself and I'm having to, in our community we call it unmasking. I'm having to learn a lot about myself, particularly neurodivergent people, but particularly neurodivergent women and girls. We mask very highly. What that means is we become chameleons socially to fit into the norm. And so for a long time you mask and you learn, one of the key things I remember, I still get this comment a lot and I always find it quite funny, is the two most popular ones I get is you don't look autistic, which is very funny because I don't know what autism looks like. And I'm like, sorry, I left my trains at home. And the other one is around pretty privilege, or you're too pretty to be autistic.
Really? Wow.
And I am 100% aware I have pretty privilege. I'm highly aware of it and I talk about it publicly that I don't look like the stereotype of autism, because autism is a stereotype that we've all thought at one point, and it's all the Rain Mans, the Sheldon Coopers, the Amy's. It's these really extreme kind of genius type individuals, and it's not that at all when we're looking at things like The Good Doctor and all of these exceptional human beings. And of course there are autistic people in the world who are exceptional human beings, we all are, but not every autistic person is a surgeon, not every autistic person is a genius who can count cars and make you a millionaire in Las Vegas. So there was a lot of those stereotypes, and I think I still definitely face that stereotype. And I look back on my, definitely since becoming a mum and my kind of journey, and I was like a lot of neurodivergent women, originally misdiagnosed or diagnosed with what is the secondary condition. So when we're looking at this from a clinical point of view, neurodivergence is the primary condition. And that, as a result, causes other things. So,
okay, so let's break this down. So neurodivergent, let's just say... With dyslexia, I have dyslexia. So does that mean neurodivergent is that?
So neurodivergence is an umbrella term that incorporates many different, conditions or presentations. And it's an identity term. And the idea being that it recognizes we diverge from what is considered typical. The big call out there being what's typical. Who decided what normal is? Who decided what typical is? Is it written down somewhere? I would like to see it because I would like to know.
Yeah.
But what it kind of comes back to is that as a society, there are these unwritten rules or unwritten things around what is typical. And if you are outside of that, to your point before, you're othered. So if we're looking at neurodivergence, some really very common presentations or common things that are neurodivergent that people, it's not just autism. People think neurodivergent, autism, interchangeable labels. They're not. Neurodivergence incorporates many things, including autism, ADHD, bipolar, dyslexia, dyscalculia, obsessive compulsive disorder, tic disorders, depression, anxiety, Down syndrome, dementia, all of them recognizing that our brains inherently work, process, feel, and comprehend differently. And so when we're talking about things like dyslexia, and I have dyspraxia myself, as well as dyscalculia.
Dyspraxia.
So I have dyscalculia, which is very similar to dyslexia, but with numbers. Yep. Dyspraxia, for me, presents in my sense of awareness, particularly in the surroundings I'm in. So I have minimal hand-eye coordination. Growing up, again, I look back now and I'm like, how did no one know? Like, I was incredibly clumsy. I had no hand-eye coordination. So sports were really difficult for me. I just could not understand what you meant when you said, like, the ball's coming, hit it with the bat. Like, my brain just could not comprehend the space between the ball and the bat.
Wow, okay.
My sense of spatial awareness, I was often like, I'm covered in bruises. I was constantly walking into things, tripping over. And particularly for me, my dyslexia actually doesn't necessarily present in that the words on the page. Mine's verbal. So I know in my head the word I want to say, but the word that comes out of my mouth is often not the word that's in my head. So a really common one is like baguette and bouquet. I always get those two words.
Baguette and bouquet.
Yes. So they're two totally different things. One's bread, one's flowers. And my brain just... And one of my biggest, even still with all of the therapy and all of the supports and all of the things in place, names like Kirsty and Christy, where there's only a letter the one way round. So like Kirsty, K-I-R, Christy, K-R-I. Every time I get it wrong. Every time. And I have to like reread it 10 or 11 times and then I'll still pronounce it incorrectly.
Yeah.
So I look back now and I'm like, how do people not know? Like, and I think all of these.
Even that the English language is just... What?
Yeah, and you're like, but they're there. Like, they're the same word. Why are they different? Like, why are they spelled differently? I guess the neurodivergent piece, so particularly, I guess, my journey when I had my first son, I was diagnosed with postnatal depression and anxiety, which is a very common experience for neurodivergent women. We're misdiagnosed. And what that means is, at the time, wonderful doctors, wonderful professionals, practitioners, well-meaning people, they're not taught enough about neurodivergence to understand it. So the default is you're presenting in this way, therefore you've got depression, anxiety. So I was put on antidepressants. Those antidepressants didn't really help. And obviously now it makes sense why, because we're not treating the root cause of the problem. The root cause is that I was neurodivergent, undiagnosed neurodivergent, autistic, ADHD. I just had a baby. All of my coping mechanisms that I inadvertently had developed throughout my life disappeared, because now all of a sudden I've got this screaming baby that's constantly awake, crying, pulling at me, touching me. So all of these things I look back on now, I had very strong routines around things like my sleep. I had very strong routines around eating and meal prepping. All of those things disappeared because I became a mum with this new baby, and a baby that themselves had additional needs that they needed help with. So I look back now and it was very clear that my long journey with mental health was actually not a journey with mental health. My journey was with an undiagnosed neurodivergent condition or multiple. Once I realized that, I was able to go, oh my God, I remember feeling like such a failure as a mum all the time, because I didn't enjoy being a mum a lot of the time, especially as a young mum. My now ex-husband was in the military. He's now was a detective. He wasn't around a lot. He worked varying shifts, so I had no sense of consistency. I didn't have a great deal of support. I had the most amazing family, but again, I couldn't articulate, like, why does everyone else, like, people talk about having a baby and it's magical and all of these things, but I always felt like I was drowning. Like, I was like, I don't like this. Like, what are people saying that? And then I now realize I had an autistic child. So I had a baby that wasn't developing in the way that's considered normal. So I had a baby that wouldn't make eye contact, wouldn't look at me, didn't show affection. And so between the two of us, I now realize, I'm just like, it's laughable, but I look back and it was this whole journey, and then this realization of like, what if I'm actually not depressed and depressed and have anxiety? And a common one, anxiety attacks. It wasn't anxiety attacks. It was overwhelm, it was sensory overwhelm, because they would come quickly when I removed myself from the overwhelming stimuli, which back then was like shopping centers and things like that. All of a sudden the anxiety would disappear. So then I was like, well, it's not anxiety. And so I look back now and I'm like, oh my goodness, like, if I'd known then what I know now, it would have been so different. But look, I think probably like yourself. Do you now look back and go, oh? I
mean, looking back now, it's very negative. Like, oh, you can't read, you can't do this, you can't do that. But when I finished school, I looked up, what are the advantages of having dyslexia? And at that point, I was like, bro, this ain't a weakness. It's a goddamn strength, which was untapped in school because everyone was focused on the negative. And I'm sure with people with ADHD and dysgraphia and all that, like your ability to see patterns, which no one else is seeing, is so important. And you can see opportunities other people aren't seeing. As well as ADHD, I find that it's hyper focused on something you're passionate about. Yeah, the kid throwing stuff in the back of the class, learning about Macbeth, isn't going to be wanting to learn about Macbeth. Once that person finds that sport, that hobby they're passionate about, they're going to be 120% immersed in that, which I find is one of the misconceptions I've come across. I want to know, what do you feel the misconceptions of neurodivergent or the disability sector? Because I don't like calling it a disability sector. I don't know why it has that name. It should be an enhancement sector.
Yeah, absolutely. An all ability sector. And abilities, we only see ability sector. You're absolutely right. And I think if we look at neurodivergence in particular, like it's, you know, I work with a lot of organizations and some of them in this beautiful background now, and Lav and Legal right there, and shout out to them, they're incredible. There's still a lot of misconceptions, misunderstandings. One of the big things I talk about, that I take my role very seriously representing my community, and that's the neurodivergent community and the disability community. To your point before, there's a really interesting, even within our community, there's people have differing opinions on this. I am very proud to wear the label of being disabled. I am disabled. I'm inherently disabled by the conditions I have, but not because of the conditions themselves, which is the medical model of disability. I'm disabled by the structures that are in place, which is the social model of disability.
Right.
So medical model looks at you're disabled by your condition. You're not going to add any value to the society. We're just going to have to pay tax for you to have an NDIS plan, all of these things. The social model recognises that people are disabled and impacted by barriers. And the example I give with organisations is people who wear glasses or contacts, which is myself, right? So I'm sort of nearly -6. So it's on my driver's licence that I have to wear visual aids to drive. That in and of itself is a form of disability. And if we're looking at legal blindness as a spectrum, which it absolutely is, I am classed as legally blind. So if I was not wearing my contacts or my glasses, I cannot participate. I cannot walk in front down a road. I can't see in front of me. I can't read. I can't write. I can't drive a vehicle. I can't do any of those things. But I have contacts. So all of a sudden now I can participate in society. And when you speak to organisations and you use the example of glasses and contacts, people connect the dots because 50% of the population wear glasses. So when I say to them, if you didn't have your glasses, could you drive a vehicle? A lot of them are like, well, no. Like, could you read an email? No. Could you, like, no. So then this realisation of like, wow, so now I have glasses, I can participate. The social model of disability recognises we are impacted by barriers. And so as a neurodivergent person or a person with disability, we are impacted inherently by the barriers than we are by the condition. And if we think of the example of wheelchair users, so we know now, and as a society, we would expect all of our buildings to be accessible. We believe as a society, everyone should be able to enter a public building. So that means it would need ramps, it would need doors wide enough to fit a wheelchair, as an example. There are many inherent and many amazing positives of those things for people who are not wheelchair users. So ramps are used by people with pushchairs, with prams, who might have mobility issues, who might be wheeling a suitcase. So then we start looking at these things that help one type of person actually help lots of people. Within the neurodivergent space, and there's people even in our community that don't like using the word disabled or don't believe it's a disability, and everyone has their own view, and I'm not here to sort of present or change that. But I do recognise I'm inherently disabled by the barriers that I face. So as a neurodivergent person, I am in a community and in a society that is not made for brains like mine. And I know that because when I am in my community and when I am in places and spaces that are made for brains like mine, I'm able to participate a lot more fully. And I look at the schooling system as a great example of that. Much like yourself, Keone, I struggled a lot with certain things in school. I excelled at other things. I look back now and my sons go, as I said, to an incredible award-winning disability school. They truly recognise that every child learns differently and have set up different ways of learning. We came from a generation where it was one way of learning. If you didn't fit that mould, then that was it. But we now recognise, as an example, visual learners. So having, when we go on aeroplanes now, we now see in the safety rules, there are not only words, there are visuals of how to put on the seatbelt, how to put on the oxygen mask, how to put on the life jacket. All of those things help everyone. So if you are someone that is able to interpret auditory information, great, you can listen. If you are deaf, as an example, and you are relying on lip reading, you are going to be able to do that because they're visually doing it for you as well. So the sort of, I guess the culmination of all of these things is if we include everyone, we exclude no one, and inclusion actually benefits everyone. You asked me before about what are some of the, I guess, the biggest misconceptions. I still even now recognise there are a lot of misconceptions from internalised ableism, and that's a really
what does that mean?
Yeah, such a wanky term. It's this idea that all of us have unconscious bias. Every single one of us, you and I, Q, have it. The first step is recognising we have it, so recognising those biases that we have. Internalized ableism is that there is a lot of things within the disability sector and community. So our people living with disability, the amazing community I'm part of, a lot of the barriers or the misconceptions we face are actually from people believing things about us, firstly, without having experienced it, and secondly, not understanding it, but putting it down to a personality flaw. So as an example, thinking that people with ADHD or autism or neurodivergent people are just lazy. Well, they would do it if they wanted to. It's not that simple. Like, it's not laziness. It's, as an example, it's processing delays, it's executive function disability. So all of these factors that mean that your version of, oh, that's a really easy task, why do you struggle with it? As an example, putting the laundry away, we're likely to struggle with those simple tasks. But we excel and find things easy that the average population find incredibly difficult.
Yeah,
an example
exactly.
You gave before, pattern recognition. You've created a podcast. You're less than 20 years old and you started a podcast. How many grown-ass adults do you know that can say, I started a podcast and I've interviewed dozens of people and learned all these amazing things?
Yeah.
Minimal. So there's an inherent sense of some of the things that we experience being laziness. I think some of it as well is that you just don't know what you don't know. So if you've grown up and you haven't experienced it, I meet many adults who will come to me after I've done presentations or events or talks, and they'll say to me like, I'm realizing I have not had much exposure to people with disability. I didn't grow up with it, and particularly in Australia when we're looking at like regional and remote locations, a lot of people say to me like, I haven't really experienced this before. I've never really heard about it. And one of the biggest things that I think, if people listening will take away is like, just be a little bit more curious. Knowing what you don't know is incredibly powerful, and just being able to learn something new is like such a privilege. And I think neurodivergent people, one of our greatest strengths is we're innately so curious, and and for some people, as an example, that curiosity. So we ask a lot of questions. Some people interpret that as being defiant or being like abrasive or not, and a big thing of like not settling for the status quo. But that's the point. If we settle for the status quo, we wouldn't have the things we have.
Exactly.
And some of the most incredible inventions in time and space and everything else have been created by people that have brains that were different.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up. Like, I know Richard Branson had dyslexia. And
yep.
ADHD as well. Like,
also, yep.
I read a book, I forgot what it's called, but it was so eye-opening to me in the fact that he didn't know what profit, loss, a balance sheet was, net profit, what's that? And he had his accountant explain to him, it's like, think of the money, fish in an ocean. The net profit is the net scooping up all the fish, and that's what's left, and the rest of the profits for elsewhere. And then he goes, oh, okay.
Yep.
Like something so simple, just because he just sees things differently, as well as I know Jamie Oliver, he's dyslexic as well.
Yes. Yeah. And if you think of like Jamie Oliver is such a brilliant example, and I'm a big Jamie Oliver fan, and particularly coming from the UK and the incredible work he did with the school system around school lunches there. But if you look at Jamie Oliver, cooking and chefs in particular, historically, had been seen, it was, French cuisine and arty-farty and out of the realms of possibility for the average person. Jamie Oliver, the Naked Cooks, is a little bit before your time now, but we're going back probably 30 years now, 25, 30 years. He catapulted into the cooking scene. He was this young, easy to understand, put things in really relatable terms. And we look at his, what he's achieved with his culinary amazing career, but he's always stayed true to making it easy to understand, making it accessible for the everyday person. And particularly when we were looking at the cost of living crisis and things like that. So he started that whole four ingredient cookbook idea, which was this idea of a lot of families were struggling to make ends meet. They might have had a hodgepodge of stuff in their fridge. They couldn't afford fresh stuff, so they were buying frozen vegetables. So, and he was saying, but frozen vegetables are just as good for you as fresh vegetables, if not better, because they're in the best quality that you're going to be able to get. You're not going to buy them, let them go off and throw them in the bin. And when you look at that, like the, chefs before him had all these Michelin stars and these other things, and he's done amazing things in his culinary career, but he was so accessible and he understood that people they weren't confident using certain terms like sauteing and like all these fancy things. And I look back and I'm like, he was young. He was in his 20s when he started his original kind of cooking career and cooking show. And still one of my favorite chefs of all time. And I love his books, even the way they're written. They've all got images in them because he understands that everyone's like learns differently. We need visuals as well. What does good look like? He'll often have a picture at the end of what it's meant to look like. So like, okay, this is what it's like. Oh no, I'm on the wrong track. It's meant to be brown and it's white. Incredible. But you got Richard Branson, and the founder of the e-ticket, or the creator of the e-ticket for airlines, had ADHD because he kept losing his tickets. Yeah. And things that you go, wow, like, and there's been a lot of talk in the media about the creator of Wi-Fi and that they believe the creator of Wi-Fi had ADHD. There are incredible people. Emma Watson has dyslexia and ADHD. The founder of IKEA has ADHD. Some of our incredible, amazing actors and actresses and artists in this world are autistic. Anthony Hopkins being a great example. He, found out he was autistic in his 70s.
Wow.
And I think some of that is, when you look at Anthony Hopkins, an incredible actor, right? His ability to read other people's language, body language, human behavior, and then be able to reenact that as an actor is an incredible skill. And that's because he is able to see people's body language and their tone and their mannerisms in a way that neurotypical people don't.
I think you were saying when we had coffee a few months back, you were saying that's one of your strengths as well. Yeah.
Yes, pattern recognition, but mine is not maths, unfortunately. Mine is human behavior, absolutely. And so I've been able to harness that and turn it into a career around changing human behavior. In a corporate world, we call it new ways of working. It's the exact same thing. You want them to change their behavior. We've just given it a different title.
Yeah.
But that's also really relevant for areas like user design and experience when we're looking at those types of things. Having an understanding of how your user, whether that's your customer or client or patient, is going to use your product or interpret your product. Things like, particularly in the corporate world, seeing patterns in behavior, but seeing patterns in things like themes. So recognizing that, as an example, we now see with data, etc., that we see an increase in work health and safety incidents and accidents around the Christmas festive period. So now we're recognizing that's a theme. We can then be like, okay, well, why is that? And then you can start looking at the data to support to go, okay, that could be due to fatigue. People are tired. They're looking forward to the end of the year. Is it things like people are drinking more than they normally would? Is it they're a bit more relaxed? Like, looking at those sorts of things. And then when you get into the tech space, then you can see how that plays out in things like cybersecurity. People who are neurodivergent people, particularly autistic people, I will say are phenomenal testers in the tech space because they will find that little hole that someone else hasn't found and they will break it. So if you're working in tech space like I do, you want those people to try and break your system. You want them to break it so you can fix it before you then deploy it out to 1,000 other people who are going to try and also break it. So yeah, I think the misconceptions, I think some of the really common ones are based on our own kind of inability or lack of understanding. I think some of it as well is just people have this expectation on this like one way of thinking. And a really common thing is like neurodivergent people in particular often get accused of being too direct or being abrasive or rude. But on the flip side, we're constantly told clear communication is key. But then when we're clear, we're told that we need to soften our delivery. So I think there's a lot of miscommunication or misunderstanding. And also just that things like small talk, like a lot of neurodivergent people really struggle with this like kind of really average, like, oh, look at the weather today. Like, I would much rather have a connected conversation with you, even if it's for only 2 or 3 minutes, and talk about something you're really passionate about because that fuels like you. I can see you're excited about it. But I think we come a long way. Society's come a long way. We recognize that people of differing abilities and different styles and different minds add such value to our culture. And I think a lot of that is this last generation where we've got particularly people, ultimately that emotional connection. So when people know someone with a disability, whether it's a child, a partner, a sibling, or on the flip side, we're also recognizing there are people becoming carers, particularly if they're aging parents with things like dementia, who are now in a position they weren't expecting to be in. And so when I work with organizations and I chat with people, there's still a misconception that you're born with a disability, and you absolutely can be, but there's also acquired disabilities and disabilities that happen due to aging in particular, and we are in a heavily aging population. So over 50% of older Australians are living with a disability. So over half of people over the age of 60 have a disability. So they're not necessarily born with those. And so then it's recognizing, okay, now you're in the position you're caring for a parent or a grandparent, and they need very different things than what they needed a few years ago.
I think that's what makes your work so powerful too, with being really resonated with the education and awareness, which, like you were saying, the misconception of awareness is so like vague these days. Like knowing more about it definitely adds to that inclusivity, which relates back to your mission.
Yeah.
So with your work, you were saying that small talk and stuff, how some people may struggle with that. With your workshops and stuff, is that something you focus on as well?
Yeah, great question. So the organisation I have is kind of in two key streams, and one part of it is working with organisations, and that could be working with leadership teams, working with HR teams, also working with things like employee network groups. So often in large corporate organisations, they would have like a network group for, say, the LGBTQI plus rainbow community. They might have one for people with disability, might have a sort of gender equity space. So I work with those organisations and do many things there. And then the other part of my organisation that's community focused and a kind of not-for-profit setup is working within our community around things like Connection Collective. So not only things like social events, but also things like professional development, learning particularly ways to harness our neurodivergent brains to actually be a huge benefit. To answer your question, I don't do workshops on things like small talk and things like that for a couple of reasons. Number one, we're looking at strengths, and we don't ever want people to have to change who they are innately to fit in. But what we do is workshops on how sometimes, particularly neurodivergent individuals, how we intend to present and how we do present are a little bit different. And whilst we can only control and influence ourselves and our own emotions, sometimes it's helpful if you have someone else in your community who can talk about the things they've done that have worked really well, or experiences they've had that have helped them. And so it could be things like, hey, like, you've spoken about in this organisation, you're having conversations about people are saying you're too direct, as an example, or people are saying X, Y, and Z. Something I've noticed is that a lot of neurotypical people like really appreciate you saying, "Hey everyone, happy Monday," and it's not meant to be, and that sounds really like paternalistic and a little bit like, but it's more around when you have a brain that's different. You don't know that it's different because it's your brain. And so then when you're in a situation where you've got other people who are looking at you like you're the odd one out, sometimes it's nice having someone that's like, hey, I've been in that situation. What I found really helpful was X, Y, and Z. Or struggling with time management is a really common thing for ADHDers, and particularly when you look at professional settings and in this world we're in now where everything's meeting after meeting and everything's time and billable hours. And so our community, one of our favourite ones to do is like how to harness technology to help you with your productivity and to help you with your time management. Things like focus time blocking, alarms, different things that I hazard would also massively help neurotypical people, but you don't know what you don't know. And so sometimes your community is actually, I truly believe your community is where you learn the most things that are able to help you thrive. And so things like using tech and turning off notifications and different things, so you're not constantly overwhelmed, to help you set yourself up for success. We can't guarantee success, but we can put structures and systems in place. James Clear, who wrote Atomic Habits, which I absolutely love, and I'm sure you've read the book as well. There's a sort of quote in there, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but it's along the lines of, we don't rise to the standard of our goals, we fall to the level of our systems. Yes. And for me, that is so symbolic of our society and community and the systemic structures and barriers that are in place, but particularly in organisations, what are the systems we have in place to support people? And then when we look at it at an individual level, what are the systems I have in place to help me in my life to thrive? So as an example for me personally, I struggle with executive function. So again, I just grew up my whole life thinking I was lazy and a piece of shit and couldn't do certain things. But I realize now the executive function part I struggle with. So executive function is following, doing the laundry. A neurotypical person might see that as 2 steps, like doing the laundry, put it in, get it out. For me, I recognize there's actually like 12 steps in that process, because you have to collect the dirty laundry, then separate it into different colors, then check the materials, then do this, then put it in the machine, then put it in, then take it out, then hang it up, then take it off the line. So I struggle to complete those things because there's so many steps in the process.
Or you would do like half and then be like,
and get distracted. Or like, I'm not motivated to do it because I'm not interested in it. So some of the structures I have, as an example, with cleaning, right? So I have a cleaner, and I'm highly aware of the privilege in me saying that sat here today. But for me, it is literally priceless. That $80 is priceless because I work full time, I have 2 children, I have a business, etc. That for me is like that time is so invaluable. So getting back 2 hours a week and someone doing it and I know it's done, and also it's done to such a higher standard than I would do it. And I think there's Michelle Cohen, who works with the AFLW, incredible. I saw her at a Women in Tech event, and she spoke about to be your best, outsource the rest. And she was talking about, as women, we cannot have it all, and particularly professional working mothers, we have this ridiculous idea that we're supposed to have it all. And it's absolute bullshit, for one.
Yep.
But secondly, life is a juggling act with balls, and my big thing is stop trying to think I'm not going to drop the ball. You are going to drop a ball, babe. Focus on dropping the plastic ones, not the glass ones. So the glass ones are important things, right? They're important. The plastic ones are like, you think they're important, they're really not that important.
Yeah.
Does it really matter if your kid has toast for dinner? No. Does it really matter if they go to school with odd socks? No. Does it really matter if they're going to have ice cream twice on a Saturday? No. Like, let's just be kinder to ourselves. Focus on not dropping the glass balls and let the plastic balls go. And so with that in mind, there was things I had to set up around things like cleaners and things like that. But as neurodivergent people, we're not taught any of those things, right? So especially if you get a diagnosis as an adult, it's like,
even that
what do
in
I
school,
do now?
like, you're not taught how to utilize other people's skills and their strengths to fill in your blank spaces as
so
such.
There's an incredible woman that I will reference here, and I would love for you to meet her. Her name's Yvette, and Yvette is a very good friend of mine. Yvette is also an incredible powerhouse of all women, and her and I have spoken at many events, and she has dyslexia, and she's an incredible professional, works in the change space similar to myself. She talks about people, you know, it still makes me laugh. People think she can't read and can't write. One of the things, and I would love for you to meet her because I think it would be so great for you as an individual as well.
Yeah.
But she talks about, as an example, like, why did no one teach her in school that audiobooks were just as valuable as reading a book?
Exactly.
Like, that's a great example of putting a system in place. So she was saying how she'll sometimes do the audiobook and read the book, or sometimes just do the audiobook. She talks about, she's very open about her strengths with her team, and then says, you know, I have dyslexia. So even though we have Microsoft Word and email and all of the other things that will pick up spelling, grammatical errors, sometimes, firstly, it doesn't always work. Secondly, it doesn't make sense what I'm trying to say because what's in my head is not what's coming down on paper.
Or you spell the word so wrong so many times.
And it gives up on you. Like, the AI's like, you're on your own, bro. We don't even know what you're trying to say. So she talks about she'll have people in her team that will check her work, etc., for her before it's sent, because she knows her incredible strengths sit here, but she needs help with these things. Likewise, those people that are incredible strengths here might not have these skills here. And those are exactly the type of things that we talk about. And then you learn as you go through life how inherently things are set up in a certain way. And having dyslexia is a great example of that. When we look at menus in restaurants, right? A disability access tool that's used, and it's a really common, you know, often these places that have QR codes on the table. When you QR code, you scan for the menu, they'll often have a photo of what the meal looks like.
Yeah, I love that.
That is so good. And it's also a disability access tool for people that can't read and write. And you might not be able to read and write for many reasons, but a really common one being English as a second language. Writing something down just with words and not knowing what it looks like. Whereas if you've got a menu that has a visual of what that burger looks like, all of a sudden you're like, that's the one I want to have. And so I think as you go through life, you realize there are things that we do that inherently aren't super inclusive. And then you look at other things and go, what an incredible idea. The way they've now set this up means that people who English is a second language can see visually what they're ordering rather than a bunch of words. Like if we went to a restaurant overseas, I was in Greece, I speak minimal Greek. I couldn't read the menus, but if they had photos, I knew what it was. Like, great, yeah, that's what I wanted. Like, that's what I was looking for.
Even those, like, fancy restaurants with some random sauce from Japan or something. And
yes.
It's like, what?
Are you like, is that a cheese? Like, what is that? Like, you're like asking the waiter, like, what does this word mean? But she's incredible. And again, so looking at those kind of systems that we have in place and how do we put those systems in place in our personal lives, in our professional lives to help us? Because if we've got these systems in place, we've got a much better chance than relying on sheer willpower or relying on the opposite, which is the most common thing I see in our neurodivergent community and I barrel against every day, is that we think we are going to shame ourselves into change. We think if we tell ourselves enough horrible, hurtful things, it will eventually change the outcome. You're so lazy. Why can't you just do this? You're so stupid. Why could you not just write that down the first time and get it right? Like, human beings will never shame themselves into change, but they can celebrate themselves into recognizing what does need to change and support themselves. Shaming into change, and that's the same for everything. Corporates, schools, education settings, partners. you will never shame someone into changing. It won't work. It might work in the short term, but it's not sustainable, much like fear is not a great form of consequence management. It might work in the short term, but we will never shame ourselves into change. And that's probably the biggest takeaway I would love our neurodivergent community to know.
I feel that. You
shaming yourself, you are not going to change it. What you can do is celebrate the beautiful human being you are and recognize there are certain things you need help with. And so recognizing now, as an example, the library now has audiobooks. Awesome. I'm gonna listen to those books rather than read them.
Yeah.
It's the same outcome. Podcast, great example. Brilliant thing for people that are auditory processors, but also are able to do other things.
Exactly.
So doing, being able to do my laundry while listening to your podcast is much easier for me than sitting there doing my laundry on my own with nothing to help me. So
yeah, that leads me to our last question. Yes. The traditional question I asked on this podcast. If you could go back to your younger self, whether it's your 18-year-old self, 14-year-old self moving to Australia, what would you tell yourself and why, and would you do anything different? It's a hard question. Yeah.
It is. I feel like we should ask ourselves these questions more often, to be honest. I would tell her, and this sounds very cliche, but I would tell her she is so much more capable than she realizes, and that her passion and love and all of those wonderful things about her will always outweigh her fear. And that she is so much more capable than she realizes.
I feel that.
And I look back on so many of the things that have happened in my life, whether it's divorce, having additional needs children, single parenthood, financially, traveling, my business. Like many ADHDers, I've definitely got an entrepreneurial spirit. I've had 3 businesses on top of my day jobs. All of which I remember at the time distinctly, and I've made reels about people telling me were a stupid idea and have gone on to all be profitable businesses. I would tell her she's a lot more capable than she realizes. Her fear, everything else about her outweighs her fear. Fear and anxiety, but fear in particular stopped me from doing a lot of things when I was growing up. I recognize that's absolutely in part of my neurodivergent brain. But the things I'm scared of, that, a lot of people, things that gave me fear, other people couldn't relate to because it wasn't the fear they were expecting. So I will tackle a snake, jump out a plane, and I'm like, oh, okay. But things like changing my routine, so traveling is a really great example of that. Even though I love it and it's a holiday and it's all these wonderful things, it's a massive change in my routine. I find it really anxiety inducing and quite stressful. So I would tell her she's much more capable than she realizes. And I would also tell her that everything works out in the end and that what's meant for you will always find you. And that the journey you're on is actually the journey. That's the really important part. The destination.
I think that's very important for even myself, like still trying to figure stuff out. Like it's an endless game, but just having it in the back of the mind, like it's going to work out. Yeah, it's a very good lesson to keep in mind.
And you are so young and you've got so much life ahead of you. And I'm in my 30s and I'm realizing that I think the hack is, there is no single endpoint. There is no, I figured it out, tick the box, move on. Like the journey you're on is where it's at. And I think the last thing I would tell her is that all of those things that you are worried are the things about you that you're too much, you're too emotional, you're blah, 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 are the absolute best parts about you. And that even though earlier on in your career and earlier on in your, childhood and education and stuff, you were told those things were the things you needed to change, absolutely not. And I would say the same thing for any neurodivergent adult, young person. Those very things about you are the best parts about you. And the world, more than ever, needs courageous, passionate, empathetic, loving human beings now more than ever. And do not let other people's fear or other people's perceptions of that make you change who you are, because they're absolutely the best part about you. And I think I try to tell myself that every day, that I look back and I think the 15-year-old girl that I used to be would think I'm the coolest thing ever. And I have to remind myself of that sometimes. Like she would be like, oh my God, look at what you're doing. I'm recording a podcast overlooking here. Like I could never have guessed this would be on my bingo card. And I'm so glad of this journey. And I'm so excited that it's still a journey. Like how, one thing I've learned through separation and stuff was, the bad news is you're on your own. The great news is you're on your own. So it's the same thing, right? Yeah. The bad news is it's a journey. The great news is it's a journey. Like it could go anywhere at any time. And how exciting to be a human being on this planet at the same time as some incredible people like you.
I feel that. Thank you, Amber. For the audiences that are wanting to know a bit more about you, where can they go to find out more about what you do and interested in your business?
Come be my friend. So I have all of the relevant socials, including my LinkedIn, so Amber Antony, but we also have a website, Neurospicy Collective.
All of it will be linked in the description.
Yes, thank you. And we hold a range of very regular connection and events for folks. Most of them are free or at cost. We also have a range of different options for folks that might not be able to participate otherwise. And everybody of every type of every human being possible is welcome, and we would love to have you there. And yeah, thank you for having me, Kioni.
Thank you so much, Amber.
What an awesome experience.
And I have to say, it worked out very well sitting on this lovely bench.
Look at this, and this beautiful weather, and I could not think of a better way to wrap up 2024 than sitting here today with this weather. Absolutely amazing.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Amber.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into the Growth Concept podcast. I hope this conversation with Amber Antony has opened your mind to the power of neuro-inclusion and the importance of creating spaces where people can show up as their full, authentic selves. Amber's work with Neurospicy Collective is making a real impact, and if you want to get involved or learn more, all her resources are linked below. If this episode resonated with you in any sort of way, I challenge you to share it with a friend, subscribe, and leave a review. Your support fuels this podcast, helps us bring more conversations like this to the table, and in return, I will do my absolute best to keep improving this podcast every single day. Until next time, stay curious, keep growing, and I'll see you in the next episode on The Growth Concept. See ya.